Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're on to the second stage of the Comical Grasshopper build. So far we've added bearings to the gearbox and built the rear suspension. We're on to bag B now, which has all the bits to put the chassis together, add the steering and front suspension. Here we go then, step 5, setting up the steering servo. We're going to need some screws, but which ones exactly depend on your servo. Most Metal Gear servos these days will use an M3x10, but do check with the screw that comes with your servo and match it. Otherwise, we're going to need two 5mm ball ends and an M3 shake-proof washer. For plastic, we need top to bottom, B2, the plastic washer, B10, the servo saver arm, B6, the spring, then B11 or 12 for the boss. Which one you choose depends on the servo. Ours is Futaba compatible, 25 teeth on the spline, so we use B12. For setting up, we would usually use a servo tester just to make things easy, but being a beginner kit and setup, we'll follow the instructions and use the ESC and radio. There's a bit more to connect up, but it'll work just fine. Some things might be a bit different depending on your exact radio, but generally they're going to be fairly similar. We'll need to connect the ESC to channel 2 on the receiver and the steering servo to channel 1. Generally, the black or brown wire wants to go towards the outside edge. Before we can use the system, we're going to need to bind the receiver to the transmitter. The procedure depends a lot on the radio, but usually it's going to involve a bind plug or a button. Check your radio's manual to work out what you need to do. With the battery connected, we can turn on the ESC. The receiver is going to blink its LED while in bind mode, so we know it's ready. Now on the transmitter, we hold the bind button and turn it on. The receiver LED stops blinking to let us know it's bound. All that's left is to turn it all off, remove the bind plug, and well, that should be everything connected up. On the transmitter, we need to make sure the trims are neutral or zeroed, the idea being the servo will be centered. We can fiddle with the steering to check the servo works. It should follow the wheel nicely and go back to center when we let go. While everything is still powered, we can fit the servo saver. First the boss fits over the splines. We want it to fit so the tab is towards the nearest mounting lug, upwards as I'm holding it. There's a fair chance it's not quite going to sit perfectly straight, so experiment a bit and find a position that is the closest. Next the spring goes on with the gap over the tab. Next is the arm with its tab in the gap in the spring. Then we have the shape-proof washer, followed by the plastic washer. And lastly we use the screw that matches the servo. In this case it's the M3x10 to hold it all together. Hold the servo arm as you go, so you're not fighting the servo by doing up the screw. So the arm can connect to the linkages, we need to screw in 2 of the ball ends. They just thread straight into the plastic, so as usual we're going to need to be careful not to over tighten them and strip out the holes. When done, you should find the wheel on the transmitter moves the servo smoothly and accurately. If your transmitter has a sub trim, or of course you can just use the regular trims, you can use them to straighten up the servo arm so it's correct when we set up the linkages. With all that set up, we can turn everything off, disconnect the ESC and servo, so we're ready for the next step. Step 6, linkages and mounts. We need 2 3x10 self-tappers, 2 M3 washers and the 2 linkage rods, 4 5mm rod ends and 2 L14 servo mounts. First we're going to make up the linkages, and basically all we need to do is thread on the rod ends and set up the length. We'll need to hold the rods with some pliers to grip them, but we don't want to mark them up, so we're going to use a bit of cardboard so there's a bit of protection. To make it even easier, we can use some parallel jawed pliers. They magnify your effort quite a bit, so you can really grip the shaft and not slip. Once you've got a good grip, we can thread on the rod ends so the gap between them is 35mm. You can match up to the diagram, or you can measure with a ruler or vernier. You need to be fairly accurate so the buggy drives nicely, but don't worry too much as you almost always need to tweak them a little bit to get the toe in or toe out just so. Next we have the mounts, and if you look closely you'll note they have a spacer built into one side. That's because the height of a standard size servo isn't exactly standard. We need to measure from the underside of the servo's mounting lug to the top of the servo case. If it's more than 8mm, we use the flat side under the lug, and if it's less than 8mm, we use the side with the spacer. To attach it, we use the self-tappers with the washers. Now, normally we'd leave them loose and nip them up later, but access will be a bit tricky, so we're just going to have to do them up now. Not really a problem, but just try to line up the mount so they're nice and square and level. The last thing to do is clip the rod ends on the balls on the servo saver. They need a good squeeze with some pliers. The trick is to try and be smooth and controlled so you don't slip. The balls are pretty hard, probably steel, so they're quite tough, but still take some care over them. Step 7. Fitting the servo to the chassis. We need 10 3x10 self-tappers, an M3 washer, the two halves of the chassis, D1 and D2, and there's the front bumper mount, F3. The first bit to do is fit the servo. We offer it up to the holes in D1 and thread in one of the screws in the frontmost round hole. Do it up so it's still a little bit loose, then we thread in another screw, this time with a washer, and we thread it in through the slotted hole. This time we nip it up all the way and we tighten up the front screw too. Next, the other chassis half lines up with the first and we install the 4 screws to hold them together. Now there's quite a few holes around the chassis, so check with a diagram to make sure you get the right ones. The last step is to offer up the suspension mount to the front of the chassis and install the last 4 screws. Do up all 4 loosely at first just to get it all lined up, then go around and nip them up properly. Step 8. The front arms. Now this is almost exactly the same as the first step in the manual, except the arms are ever so slightly a different shape. We'll need 4 3x10 self-tappers, 2 5mm ball ends, 2 N1s and 2 N4s. For the 2 assemblies we need to take an N1 and an N4 and slide them together with them moulded in lines at the same end, just like we did with the rear arms. Then thread in and tighten up 2 of the screws. Next we thread in one of the ball ends in the inner hole, and remember to take care not to over tighten and strip the plastic. Repeat with the rest of the bits and well, that's 2 arms ready to go. Step 9. Fitting the arms. We're going to need 2 3x14 step screws, 2 5mm ball ends and the large U-shaped suspension pin. And for plastic there's 2 N6 top links. And of course we're going to need the arms that we just put together. To get them out of the way, we'll start by fitting the ball ends to the chassis. As usual, with threading a machine thread into plastic, we'll need to be careful not to over tighten them. Next, the top links go in using the step screws. Check the diagram to get the orientation. We want the screw to go through the chassis and thread into the bit on the link with the raised bump. For the lower arms, we need to pop them onto the U-pin just up to the gap. Then offer them up to the chassis and with a bit of a wiggle and a little bit of pressure, push the pin in so it goes all the way through and sits right up against the chassis. The pin has a tapered end so it should find its way fairly easily. Step 10. The front stub axles. We're going to need 4 4x11.5 step screws, otherwise known as the kingpins, 2 5mm ball ends, 4 1150 bushings, which we're going to replace with proper bearings, 2 wheel axles. Now these are the same as the rear ones, but of course they're not going to be driven. And we need 2 large body clips. For plastic we need 2 B1 C-hubs and 2 B9 knuckles. Starting with the axles, we need to pop a bearing onto the shaft and insert it from the inside of the knuckle, pressing the bearing into place. Then from the outside we press in another bearing and clip in a body clip to stop the axle from falling out. Just as the rear, if you're using bushings, don't forget to grease up, but with bearings it's best just to leave them dry. Next we need to screw in a ball end into the ends of the arm. Don't forget to make one left hand and one right hand knuckle. On one side we thread the ball into the top and the other side we thread it into the bottom. Now all we need to do is offer up the knuckle to the C-hub and thread in a kingpin top and bottom. In most cases you're going to want to nip them up all the way, take up the slack, then back them off an 1/8 of a turn or so just to make sure the steering is nice and free. You might need to experiment a little bit just to get them just so. When you've got a left and right assembly built, well, that's step 10 complete. Step 11, fitting the hubs. This time we need 2 3x14 step screws, 2 3x10 self-tappers and 2 3x32 screw pins. For plastic there's M8, the bit that holds the lower pin in place. To fit the hubs we offer up the wide end to the lower arm on the appropriate side, then pop in one of the pins. At the top we line up the top link with the hub and screw in a step screw. Then at the bottom we screw in the screw pin all the way. With that done we just need to hook up the steering by clipping the rod ends onto the balls on the knuckles. Just like with the servo saver we need to use some pliers and some very careful pressure. Repeat on the other side and we can fit the retainer for the lower pin. It just goes up against the 2 inner posts on the chassis and we use the 2 screws to attach it. It should fit nice and square and flat. If not, the pin might not be fully in, so give it a good wiggle and make sure it is. Make sure the arms can freely move up and down without binding. They should flop around just with the aid of gravity. And that's the end of bag B. I was planning to go straight into bag C as well, but I think for the sake of it being easy to find, we're going to save that for next week. It only covers the build of the dampers, which are simplified compared to the usual Tamiya CVAs, so it is going to be a short video. Maybe if I can get out with some RCs next week, we'll have a double bill. In the meantime, that's going to be it for this week. So I hope you had a good Christmas and got some good loot, or just found something fun to do. It's going to be next year before the next video, so Happy New Year too. As always then, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!